The ship's log recorded it in 4 words. Sentence carried out, witnessed. 4 words. No description of what happened between the reading of the charges and the writing of that final entry. No account of how long it took. No record of what the man said, or didn't say, or couldn't say by the end. Just 4 words and a date, scratched into the log by a quartermaster who had either run out of language or decided that language wasn't equal to what he'd seen. That gap, between the charge and the sentence, between the offense and the consequence, is where the real history of pirate justice lives. Not in the famous punishments that historians catalog and readers recognize. In the ones that never made it into the textbooks, because what happened was too specific, too strange, too human to reduce to a clean narrative. This is Script 4 in this series. Scripts 1, 2, and 3 covered the architecture of pirate punishment, the cat, the keel hauling, the marooning, the sweat, the wooding, the psychology of certainty and witness and identity. If you've watched those, you know the framework. What follows now are the punishments that framework doesn't account for. The ones that existed in the margins of the pirate codes, in the discretion of individual captains, in the specific cruelty that emerged when men with absolute authority over other men found themselves at sea with no oversight and no ceiling. These are the punishments that broke men completely. Start with a practice so simple it sounds almost administrative. Pirates called it the gauntlet. Other maritime cultures had versions of it. But the pirate gauntlet had specific characteristics that distinguished it from its naval equivalents, and those distinctions matter. The entire crew formed 2 parallel lines on deck, facing each other, roughly an arm's length apart. The condemned man was placed at one end of the corridor they formed. He was given a head start, sometimes 10 seconds, sometimes counted aloud by the quartermaster, sometimes simply gestured. And then he ran. Every man in both lines held something, a rope end, knotted, a belaying pin, a wooden stave, a length of chain. Whatever was at hand, whatever the captain had specified or left unspecified. As the condemned man ran the corridor, every man he passed struck him. Once each, by the rule most captains enforced. Once from both sides simultaneously, from men who had been standing waiting, who had time to wind up, who knew exactly when the target would be level with them. The gauntlet was not primarily a physical punishment. It was a social one. Here is what made it distinct from simple flogging. In a flogging, the crew watched. In the gauntlet, the crew participated, but not collectively, the way Moses's law required every man to deliver a lash in turn. In the gauntlet, every man acted simultaneously and independently. Each man made his own private calculation about how hard to strike, whether to hold back, whether to put his full weight into it. And the condemned man, running the corridor, felt every one of those individual decisions land on his body. What survivors described, in the Admiralty trial records that historians have combed through for 3 centuries, was not primarily the pain. It was the information. Running the gauntlet told you exactly where you stood with every man on the ship. The crewmate who pulled his strike, the one who didn't, the one who stepped forward into the corridor rather than staying at his mark, the one who looked away. You felt all of it. You came out the other end knowing precisely which men pitied you, which men resented you, and which men had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. For men who lived in enforced proximity for months at a time, for whom social standing within the crew was the only currency that mattered. That knowledge was devastating in ways that outlasted the bruising by weeks. Now here is something that almost no account of pirate punishment discusses. The practice of ducking. Not keel hauling. That was covered in Script 1. Ducking was different, simpler in mechanism, more psychologically precise in effect. The condemned man was tied to a rope that ran through a block at the end of the ship's yardarm, the horizontal spar that extended out over the water at the bow. He was hoisted up, suspended over the open ocean, and then dropped. Not gradually, dropped. The rope released suddenly so he fell toward the water, then arrested just before or just at impact, then dragged up again before he could orient himself, then dropped again. The critical element was not the impact, it was the not knowing. Each drop was different. Sometimes he hit the water, sometimes he stopped just above it, close enough to feel the spray. Sometimes he went under briefly. The interval between drops varied, the height varied. Everything that might allow the condemned man to prepare himself mentally, to brace, to hold breath, to anticipate, was deliberately randomized. Dutch naval records from the 17th century, which documented ducking in considerable detail because it was a formal punishment in the VOC's maritime code, describe its psychological effect with unusual precision for the period. Men subjected to extended ducking, more than a dozen drops, exhibited what the Dutch physicians of the time called geestelijke verwarring. Mental confusion, an inability to sequence thoughts, to track time, to maintain the basic cognitive coherence that makes experience bearable. The body's fear response, triggered repeatedly with no resolution, consumed cognitive resources until there were none left for anything else. Pirates adopted ducking from the naval tradition and modified it in one specific way that the formal navies had not. They made it social. The crew gathered at the rail and watched. Not silently, unlike the formal ritual witnessing of floggings, but watching in whatever way felt natural to them. Some watched quietly, some called out, some turned away. The condemned man between drops could see them all, could see his crewmates at the rail, could read their faces during the seconds he was suspended above them. That visibility, the condemned man's face visible to the crew during his worst moments, the crew's faces visible to him, created a specific dynamic that straight physical punishment did not. The punishment became a kind of forced intimacy. Everyone present saw something they couldn't unsee. The crew saw what extremity did to a man's face. The man saw what his extremity did to his crewmates' faces. The shared experience altered relationships aboard the ship for weeks afterward, in ways that individual flogging never did. There is a punishment documented in 3 separate pirate trial records from the period between 1690 and 1720 that has no standardized name in the historical literature. Historians who have encountered it refer to it variously as riding the boom, riding the spar, or simply the riding punishment. All 3 names describe the same thing. The condemned man was made to straddle a wooden spar, one of the long cylindrical poles used in the rigging, typically 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and then hoisted into the air while straddling it, his full body weight bearing down on a single narrow edge of wood, his legs hanging free on either side with no purchase. His hands were tied behind his back. He could not shift his weight. He could not relieve the pressure. He simply sat, suspended, for whatever duration the captain specified. The spar punishment appears in the records specifically as a punishment for cowardice, for men who had failed to hold their position during a naval engagement, who had hidden below decks or abandoned their post at a gun. It was chosen for those offenses with deliberate symbolic logic. A coward had refused to bear the weight of his duty. The punishment made him bear weight physically, publicly, in a posture that was simultaneously undignified and inescapable. Duration ranged from 30 minutes in the mildest recorded cases to several hours in the most severe. The physical damage accumulated geometrically: nerve compression, loss of circulation in the legs, damage to tissue that took weeks to fully manifest. Men who underwent the spar punishment for more than 2 hours, according to the surgeon's notes in one of the 3 trial records that document it, walked with visible difficulty for more than a week afterward. But the physical damage was secondary to the social spectacle. The man on the spar was elevated, literally above the deck, visible from most positions on the ship. He could not hide. He could not compose himself. His discomfort was continuous and visible, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about any of it. He sat there in full view, unable to perform any of the masculine self-control that pirate culture valued. No stoic silence, no controlled bearing, just hour after hour of public endurance of something he had no way to manage. For men whose entire social identity was built around physical courage and composure, the spar punishment was precisely targeted at the thing that mattered most. Here is where it gets considerably darker. The punishments documented so far, the gauntlet, the ducking, the spar, were all punishments with defined endpoints. The condemned man knew it would stop. He could count the men in the gauntlet corridor. He could see the deck when he was hoisted above it. He could hear the quartermasters count. He had a temporal horizon. The most psychologically destructive punishments in the pirate record were the ones without a defined endpoint. There was a practice, documented most thoroughly in the records of Caribbean piracy between 1700 and 1720, called working the prisoner. The condemned man was not subjected to a single defined punishment. He was instead assigned to continuous work, the hardest, most degrading labor available on the ship, under conditions designed to make it impossible to perform adequately. Impossible hours, impossible standards, tasks assigned and then reassigned mid-completion, criticism that came regardless of performance, sleep interrupted at irregular intervals, food withheld, then provided, then withheld again. Nothing that would constitute a formal punishment under the Articles, nothing that could be pointed to as a specific act of cruelty. Just a sustained, orchestrated, invisible campaign of grinding a man down through the machinery of daily shipboard life. Modern psychologists who study coercive control would recognize this immediately. It is a precise description of what researchers now call cumulative abuse, harm delivered not through a single dramatic act, but through the continuous accumulation of small indignities, each individually deniable, collectively devastating. The body never gets a clear signal to mount a crisis response. There is no single moment of extremity that allows the brain to categorize what is happening and begin processing it. The harm is constant, low-level, and unnameable, which makes it uniquely resistant to both resistance and recovery. Men subjected to working the prisoner, the ones who survived to give testimony at admiralty trials, described it consistently as worse than any defined physical punishment. Not because it hurt more in any single moment, because it had no shape, no beginning and end, no narrative structure that the mind could hold and process and eventually place in the past. It simply continued until the captain decided it had continued long enough, or until the man broke in whatever way the captain had been waiting for. Some broke through behavioral compliance so complete it amounted to the erasure of individual will. Others broke in the other direction, through the kind of desperate, explosive insubordination that finally gave the captain a specific, article-defined offense to respond to with a specific, article-defined punishment, which had been the goal all along. There is one more punishment that deserves its own examination because it operated in a category entirely separate from everything else in the pirate record. It was not physical, it was not social, it was legal, and it was, in many ways, the most total. Pirates called it turning a man before the mast. In maritime law, a man's status aboard a ship was defined by which side of the mast he stood on. Officers and warrant officers, men with authority, skill, and formal standing, were quartered aft, behind the mast. Common sailors, the ordinary working crew, were quartered forward, before the mast. The mast was not just a structural element of the ship, it was a social and legal boundary. To stand before the mast was to be ordinary. To stand aft of it was to be someone. Pirates had created within their own hierarchies a version of this distinction. Senior crew members, quartermasters, boatswains, master gunners, navigators had status. They received larger shares. They had specific authority. They were somebody. Turning a man before the mast meant stripping all of that. Publicly, formally, in front of the assembled crew. The man's title was revoked. His share was reduced to the common rate. His quarters were reassigned. His authority over any other crew member was dissolved. He was moved, in the crew's social understanding of itself, from the category of someone to the category of anyone. The physical conditions of his life changed minimally. He ate the same food, slept in a smaller space, worked harder. The material difference was real but not extreme. What was extreme was the symbolic difference. A man who had been a quartermaster, who had administered punishments, who had counted plunder, who had negotiated on behalf of the crew with captured prizes, that man was now nobody. Men who had deferred to him yesterday now did not. Men he had commanded yesterday now ignored his suggestions. The entire social architecture of his identity on that ship had been legally dissolved, and he had to continue living inside the community that had dissolved it every day, with nowhere to go and no way to recover his standing except through years of demonstrated reliability that the captain might or might not ever acknowledge. It was a kind of social death, while the body continued to live. Several accounts in the historical record document men requesting physical punishment in preference to being turned before the mast. They would take the flogging, they would take the gauntlet. They would not take the erasure of who they were on that ship, because who they were on that ship was all they had. That last detail is the thread that runs through all four of these punishments, and through all four scripts in this series, and through everything the pirate discipline system was and was not. These men had nothing on land. Most of them had been nobody on land: pressed sailors, indentured servants, freed slaves, escaped criminals, men who had been at the bottom of every hierarchy that land-based society had offered them. They came to piracy not just for the money. They came because piracy was the first place most of them had ever been anyone at all. The crew knew your name. The articles guaranteed your share. The vote counted you. The punishment rituals included you as a witness, as a participant, as someone whose presence was required and whose observation mattered. And so the worst thing the pirate justice system could do to a man was not hurt his body. It was take away the only identity he had ever been given. The punishments that broke men completely were not the ones that hit hardest. They were the ones that reached into whatever a man had made of himself on that ship and methodically, legally, witnessed by his crewmates, took it apart. 4 words in the log. Sentence carried out. Witnessed. Now you know what those 4 words could mean. The dark reality of pirate justice. Punishments that broke men completely. The ship's log recorded it in 4 words. Sentence carried out. Witnessed. No description of what happened. No account of how long it took. Just 4 words and a date. And a silence that told you everything. In this video, we go into the punishments that the history books don't name. Not the cat o' nine tails, not keelhauling, not marooning. The ones that lived in the margins of the pirate codes, in the discretion of captains, in the space between written law and what men actually did to each other on ships with no oversight and no ceiling. We examine the gauntlet. Not a beating, but a social verdict delivered by every hand on the ship simultaneously. The ducking. A punishment engineered not for pain, but for the collapse of the mind's ability to sequence time. The spar, a coward's punishment built with deliberate symbolic logic. Working the prisoner, the invisible, shapeless campaign that left no marks and broke men that physical punishment never could. And turning a man before the mast, a legal erasure so complete that men begged for flogging instead.